We're still just live streaming the meeting, and then we will get into setting up the meeting. Done. Okay, beautiful. Now we just need to find the right page, and here we go. Okay, let's see if we can do this without the computer crashing. Mirz Hashem. Got it. Good morning, Rita. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Good. Baruch Hashem. Thank God. Well, and did I hear Susie's voice on Joan's phone?
Yeah, both of us.
Okay, I guess you couldn't get back home.
Right.
Or should I say maybe this is your home?
No, too much rain for her.
Okay. So maybe you'll stay the whole rainy season.
That's what I said to her. She'll be here till November 30th and then come back 2 weeks later because it's cold.
Okay, very good. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now, and we're going to jump in. But before we do that, actually, let's quick recap. Last week we discussed we discussed how many portions the night is split into. Either the night is split into 4 sections. Each one is how many hours?
6.
If the night is split into 4 sections, how many hours is each section?
3.
3. Or the night is split into 3 sections of how many hours?
4.
4 hours. Very good. And it was a discussion between Rabbi Natan and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Each one brought proof for their we brought proofs. The Gemara brought a proof for each side and attempted to disprove each side, but the proofs all stood and the disproofs did not stand. So now we have 2 legitimate ways of looking at the night. Either there are 4 or there are 3. And because we started talking about King David, we're going to keep on talking about King David. Are you guys ready?
Sure. Yes.
Beautiful. Okay.
And we have Fanny too.
Sharing screen. And where are we? Oops. Okay. Let's go to our filters over here. Turn off the Rashi and the Tosfos. Oh, make it easier for us. Yeah. Why does it not let me click here? Okay, we'll leave it for now. Okay, so where we left off was, did King David wake up in the morning? Sorry, at midnight or in the evening? And we gave 2 different answers for that. Now, the Gemara, we said that David HaMelech, King David, let's go a little bit back. We'll recap that part so that to prepare us for where we're going to start. Incidental to the Gemara's mention of King David. Everyone have the spot?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Incidental to the Gemara's mention of King David, other sources are cited that describe his actions. Regarding that which was cited above, that he would rise in the middle of the night in order to serve his creator, the Gemara asks, did David rise at midnight? He rose in the evening, as it is written. I rose with the neshef and cried. So that's an important word over here, neshef. I rose with the neshef and cried. I hoped for your word. And how do we know that the word neshef means evening? As it is written, in the neshef, in the evening of the day, in the blackness of night and darkness. So apparently King David did indeed rise while it was still evening, because it says he arose with the neshef. And another verse says that neshef is the evening of the day. So we know that he rose in the neshef, in the evening. So the Gemara suggests several ways to resolve this contradiction. Rabbi Oshaya said that Rabbi Acha said that David said as follows: midnight never passed me by in my sleep. Sometimes I fulfilled the verse, I rose with the neshef, which is evening, and cried. Sometimes he woke up while it was still evening, but I always at least fulfilled the verse, at midnight I rise to give thanks to your righteous laws. So he would always be awake by midnight. And sometimes he would be awake even before that. He would be awake by the evening. Rabbi Zera said, until midnight, David would doze like a horse, as a horse dozes but never sleeps deeply. From midnight on, he would gain the strength of a lion. Rav Ashi said, until midnight, he would study Torah. As it is written, I rode with the Neshef and cried, and I hoped for your word. So he was learning Torah at the Neshef, and from midnight and on, he would engage in songs and praise. As it is written, at midnight I rise to give thanks. Those are three explanations on the apparent contradiction between the Neshef, between whether he rose with the Neshef, which is the evening, or whether he rose at midnight. Now comes the Gemara and flips everything on its head. To this point, the discussion has been based on the assumption that Neshef means evening. The Gemara asks, does Neshef really mean evening? Doesn't Neshef mean morning? As it is written, and David slew them from the Neshef until the evening of the next day. So in Samuel, it's talking about a war that King David was fighting, and he said that he was killing the enemies from the Neshef until the evening of the next day. Doesn't this verse mean that he was killing them from the morning until the night? In which case, Neshef must mean morning. If he started killing them in the nighttime, then it should have used one uniform word. It should have said from the evening until the evening of the next day. So does that not mean that Neshef means the morning, that he was killing them, the enemies, from the morning until the next evening? Well, the Gemara responds, no. This verse means that David slew them from one evening until the next evening. But the Gemara doesn't like that answer. The Gemara doesn't like that response. If so, let the verse be written from the Neshef until the Neshef, or from the evening until the evening. Why would the verse employ two different terms for a single concept? Rather, Rava said there are two times referred to as Neshef. And the Neshef, this word can refer to either the evening or the morning. Neshef must be understood in accordance with its Aramaic root. The night moves past, Nashav, the night moves past and the day arrives, and the day moves past and the night arrives. So Neshef could mean either morning, or Neshef could mean the evening. In English, I believe, we have the same thing. You have dawn and dusk. Dawn is the morning and dusk is
The evening.
the evening. But you can call both of them twilight. Is that correct?
I never heard the morning called twilight. Me
You never heard
neither.
of morning called
No.
twilight?
I never heard morning referred to as twilight either.
Let's see. Let's see. Let's do a quick search over here and see if the is morning called twilight. It could be that twilight is always the evening, but let's see what Google has to say. Oh, okay. So according to timeanddate.com, twilight is the time between the day and the night where there is light outside, but the sun is below the horizon. Types of twilight. There are three types of twilight. There's civil twilight, nautical twilight, and astronomical twilight. And those three actually depend on how low the sun is below the horizon. And we're actually going to get into that because it has halachic implications. When is sunset? When is sunrise? When you can see the sun? When the sun is below the horizon and twilight starts. Civil twilight occurs when the sun is less than 6 degrees below the horizon. In the morning, civil twilight begins when the sun is 6 degrees below the horizon and ends at sunrise. In the evening, it begins at sunset and ends when the sun reaches 6 degrees below the horizon. So it seems from timeanddate.com that twilight is both the morning and the evening, and the morning twilight is called dawn, and the evening twilight is called dusk. So I guess Neshef would be twilight, according to timeanddate.com. Okay, so now there are two neshefs. There's a neshef in the morning and there's a neshef in the night. I'm not sure why this is not letting me click over here and take away these boxes. Okay. And now we're ready for the question that was asked last week. When King David said, "At midnight I rise," the assumption is that he rose precisely at midnight. The Gemara asks, did David know exactly when it was midnight? Even Moses, our teacher, Moshe Rabbeinu, did not know exactly when it was midnight. When did Moses speak about midnight? What happened with Moses and midnight?
I remember something in Passover. There's
Yes.
a song, and it happened at midnight, but I don't recall what the verses were.
Very good, very good. What happened at midnight in the Passover story? Does anybody know?
Slaying of the firstborn.
The slaying of the firstborn happened at midnight. And when Moses was telling Pharaoh, he said at around midnight, God is going to start killing all the firstborns. Even Moses, our teacher, did not know exactly when it was midnight. How do we know this about Moses? As it is written that he said to Pharaoh, "Thus said the Lord, about midnight I will go into the midst of Egypt." The word "about" indicates that it was only an approximation. So now the question becomes, who said about midnight? Did God say about midnight? Or did Moses say about midnight? The Gemara clarifies. What is the meaning of the expression about midnight? Did Moses say it or did God say it? If we say that the Holy One, blessed be he, himself said about midnight to Moses, is there doubt before God in heaven? But does God not know when midnight is? Rather, this must be understood as follows. God told Moses at midnight. But from the fact that when Moses came to Pharaoh, he said about midnight, apparently Moses was uncertain about the exact moment of midnight. Moses, the greatest of all prophets, was uncertain, and David knew. So this is a stronger question, even, or perhaps a stronger question. The question that was asked last week was a question, how could King David know when midnight was? He didn't have a watch, he didn't have an alarm clock. But here we're saying even stronger. Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, who could see in the skies, he could see from one end of the world to another. He was a prophet, the greatest of all prophets. And he told Pharaoh at about midnight. Because if he would say that it's going to happen at midnight, and then it happens a few minutes before or a few minutes after, then Pharaoh will come and say, oh, it's not God, it's something else. It's a plague, it's natural, it's coincidence. In order for it to be clear that it's coming from God, it has to happen at exactly the time that God says it is. So Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu, God told Moses that at midnight, at exactly the time of midnight, I am going to go out and kill all the firstborn. Moshe Rabbeinu relays the message to Pharaoh and says, at about midnight, God is going to kill all the firstborn. So apparently, he didn't know when midnight was going to be. How could David know? The Gemara answers several answers to this question. One is that David had a sign indicator. A lyre is the type of a harp, I believe, correct?
Yeah. It's a type of harp.
You able to see me and hear me? Yeah, okay. So there was a lyre hanging over David's bed. Once midnight arrived, the northern midnight wind would come and cause the lyre to play on its own. So he had his own fancy alarm clock. He had the windows open, and in the middle of the night, the northern wind would come at exactly midnight. It would start blowing, and his harp would start playing on its own. He had his own alarm clock. And David would immediately rise from his bed and study Torah until the first rays of dawn. Once dawn arrived, the sages of Israel entered to advise him with regard to the various concerns of the nation and the economy. They said to him, "Our master, the king, your nation requires sustenance." He said, "Go and sustain one another, provide each other with what is lacking." This one, go do some business. The sages of Israel responded to him with a parable. A single handful of food does not satisfy a lion, and a pit will not be filled merely from the rain that falls directly into its mouth, but other water must be piped in. So too, the nation cannot sustain itself using its own resources. Another explanation of this, a pit can't be filled, is that if you dig up a pit and you try to put the earth back in, it won't fit. It won't fill the entire pit. So the Jews, what they were saying is that the Jews do not have enough money to support each other. We can do business and everyone could try and give what they have, but there's not enough in the general populace. We don't have enough rich people to be able to sustain the poor people by buying from them, by buying merchandise from them. So King David told them, "Go and take up arms with the troops in battle in order to expand our borders and provide our people with the opportunity to earn a livelihood." The sages immediately seek advice from Achitophel to determine whether or not it was appropriate to go to war at that time and how they should conduct themselves. And they would consult with the Sanhedrin in order to receive the requisite license to wage a war under those circumstances. They would ask the Urim V'Tumim, which was the Choshen that the high priest wore. They would ask the Urim V'Tumim whether or not they should go to war and whether or not they would be successful. So an interesting thing that we see from here is that even the king himself decided to go to war, they didn't just take up arms and start fighting. There's a Jewish way to do everything. First, they went to the head of the head of the army, the general, I guess, to determine where they should wage war. Once they had the plans of where they could go and wage war, they went to the Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish court of law. And they could not go and wage a war unless the court of law, the Jewish court of law, gave them a license and said, "Go ahead and wage war." Even after they received the blessings from the court, from the sages, they would go to the temple. The Kohen Gadol was wearing one of the breastplate with the fancy the gems, the 12 gems on it. And those 12 gems had letters on them. All the letters of the Aleph base were there. And they would ask a question. They were supposed to ask only yes or no questions. And only one question at a time. And the letters would light up with the answer. If it was yes, go to war, or don't go to war, those letters would light up. So they would ask if they should go, and then and let's say they got a yes, they should go. They asked, would they be successful? So that they should know what's going to be the outcome of the war. And only after they got the blessings from the high priest and from the sages and from the general and from the king, then they would head out to war. So the question is that this story, that was the chain of events when the Jewish people would go to war. Where do we see that hinted to in a verse? So Rabbi Yosef asked, upon which verse is this Agada based? That whole story that we said about they would first go to the general, and then they would go to the Sanhedrin, and then they would go to the high priest. Where do we see that? So as it is written in Chronicles 1, and after Achitophel was Yehoiada, the son of Benayahu, and Evyatar, and the general of the king's army, Yoav. The individuals named in this verse correspond with the roles in the Agada as follows. Achitophel was the advisor. whose advice they sought first with regard to going to war. And so it says, now the counsel of Achitophel, which he counseled in those days, was a man who inquires the word of God. So was the counsel of Achitophel, both with David and with Absalom. So we know that Achitophel was an advisor, so they would go first to an advisor. Everybody give yourselves a round of applause. We have officially finished the second folio, the fourth side of Gemara. We have finished 2 full pages, double-sided. And we are now on page number 4a. So that means they would first go to ask counsel from Achitophel, who was the advisor. Then Benayahu ben Yehoyada responds to the Sanhedrin, since he was the head of the Sanhedrin. And Evyatar corresponds to the Urim v'Tumim, as Evyasar ben Achimelech was the priest who would oversee inquiries directed to the Urim v'Tumim. And so it says regarding Benayahu ben Yehoyada's position as head of the Sanhedrin, and Benayahu ben Yehoyada was over the Kresi and over the Plesi, which is a reference to the Sanhedrin, the high court. And why was the Sanhedrin called the Kresi or Plesi? It was called the Kresi because they were decisive, kursim. They were decisive in their pronouncements. And it was called Plesi because their pronouncements and wisdom were wondrous, mufla'im. So Kresi means that they were decisive, and Plesi means that they had brilliant minds. The head of the Kresi or Plesi was the head of the Sanhedrin. According to the order of the verse, upon being instructed by King David to go to war, the sages first consulted with Achitophel, then with the Sanhedrin. Then they would ask the Urim v'Tumim, and only thereafter was the general of the king's army, Yoav, given the command to ready the military for battle. So that was all part of the story about King David waking up in the middle of the night, and then in the morning the sages would come to him and say that we need more food. Rav Yitzchak bar Ada, and some say Rav Yitzchak, the son of Rav Idi, said, from what verse is it derived that David's lyre would wake him up at midnight? The verse says, awake my glory, awake my harp and lyre, I will wake the dawn. This means that the playing lyre has already woken, and now I must engage in Torah study until dawn. So that's a verse that says that that seems to imply that the harp was playing, and that was how he knew to wake up to sing the praises of Hashem until dawn. Okay, so that's answer number 1. Answer number 1 is, how did King David know that it was midnight? Because the harp would start playing. Rabbi Zera offered a different solution to the question of whether Moses and David knew exactly when it was midnight and said, Moses certainly knew when it was midnight, and David also knew when it was midnight. They knew when it was midnight. And how do we know? So we're going to see that soon. But the Gemara first introduction asks, if David knew when midnight was, then why did he need the lyre? What do you think? If David knew when midnight was, why does he need a lyre? Why does he need a harp to start playing?
Alarm clock.
Very good. The Gemara answers he needed the lyre to wake him from his sleep. It's very good if he can tell when a midnight is, but if he's not awake, then it doesn't help him. Right? So yeah, he could figure out when midnight is exactly to the exact moment of midnight, but he still needed the lyre in order to wake him up. Similarly, with regard to Moses, so now the question is, since Moses knew the precise moment of midnight, why did he say about midnight instead of at midnight? If Moses knew when midnight was, why didn't he just say, at midnight God will come and smite the firstborn? Why did he say about midnight that God will come and smite the firstborn? Moses did so because he maintained, lest Pharaoh's astrologers err and believe midnight to be earlier. Since no disaster would have occurred, they would say, Moses is a liar. Moses spoke in accordance with the principle articulated by the master. Accustom your tongue to say, I do not know, lest you become entangled in a web of deceit. So yeah, Moses knew when midnight was, but the astrologers didn't know when midnight was. So if Moses says at midnight tomorrow night, God is going to come and smite the firstborn. And then midnight tomorrow night comes according to their broken clocks. And they say, look, the stars are in the positions, it's midnight, and no catastrophe has come. The firstborns are not dying. Moses is a liar. Moses didn't want that to happen, so he rather say, I don't know when midnight is, but about midnight, it's going to happen, rather than to look like a liar, because it's important to teach your tongue to say, I don't know. Even if you do know, but better say, I don't know, so that the other people shouldn't think you're making a mistake. It's an important lesson over here. Custom your tongue to say, I do not know. One of the hardest things to say, especially to a child or to people who look up to us. And they ask us a question, it's very hard to say, I don't know. It's a lot easier to make up something off the bat. Lamad l'shoin chaloymar eini yodea. Teach your tongue to say, I do not know.
Oh, cancel.
Okay. Rav Ashi said, this question is unfounded. I just want to pause for a moment and remember the style of Gemara and how it's important to remember that this is discussions that were happening in a classroom or a yeshiva class setting, the Talmudic Academy. We started by talking about when is the evening, when is the morning, and what time are you supposed to say Shema. And here we're in the middle of discussing Moses and Pharaoh and the astrologers. We're going to go on a lot of tangents, and eventually we'll bring everything back home. Rav Ashi said, this question is unfounded, as Moses was standing at midnight of the 13th, leading into the 14th, when he pronounced his prophecy. And Moses told Israel that the Holy One, blessed be he, said that tomorrow, at the exact time, like midnight tonight, I will go out to the midst of Egypt. This indicates that the passage should not be understood to mean about midnight, an approximation. Rather, like midnight, as a comparison, likening midnight tomorrow to midnight tonight. When Moses said like midnight, he didn't mean to say tomorrow at around midnight. He meant to say like midnight that we're standing in tonight. God is going to smite the firstborns. Not tonight, but tomorrow. But just like we are in midnight now, at this time tomorrow, God is going to come and kill all the firstborn Egyptians. So you can't say, oh, Moses didn't know. The fact that Moses said like midnight doesn't mean he didn't know when midnight was. He wasn't making an approximation about tomorrow night's midnight. He was making a connection between tomorrow's midnight and today's midnight. That just like now, like this time tomorrow, same time, different day. The Gemara further explores King David's character. It is said, a prayer of David, keep my soul, for I am pious. Levi and Rabbi Yitzchak debated the meaning of this verse and how David's piety is manifest in the fact that he went beyond his fundamental obligations. So what does it mean that David was pious? Right? If we're saying a pious person is not someone who keeps the law, a pious person is someone who goes above and beyond the letter of the law, correct? So the question here is, what did David do that made him so special? What did David do that turned him into a pious person? One said, David's declaration of piety referred to his awakening during the night to pray. And so David said before the Holy One, blessed be he, master of the universe, am I not pious? As all of the kings of the east and the west sleep until the third hour of the day. But although I am a king like them, at midnight I rise to give thanks. So one answer is, David was saying that he's pious because he wakes up very early, a lot earlier than he should, in order to pray to Hashem. And the other sage said, David said the following before the Holy One, blessed be He, Master of the universe, am I not pious? For all the kings of the East and the West sit in groups, befitting their honored status. But I sit as a judge who issues rulings for the people. Women come with questions of ritual impurity, and my hands become soiled with their blood, as I labor to determine whether or not it is blood of impurity, and she has the status of a menstruating woman, or if it's pure blood, and she is permitted to her husband. And with a fetus that miscarried at a stage of development, before it was clear whether or not it is considered a birth. And with placenta, which women sometimes discharge unrelated to the birth of a child. See Leviticus 15, 19 to 30 with regard to blood, and 12, 1 to 8 with regard to miscarriage and placenta. So a little bit of a step backwards. In the laws of mikvah, in the laws of purity and impurity. So number one is that purity and impurity is not a physical thing. Just like, does anybody know why we wash our hands for bread before we eat?
Sanitary.
Sorry?
It's sanitary.
Okay, what happens if you just washed your hands with soap? Why are we washing our hands 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3? Wouldn't it be better to wash our hands with some soap and water?
Yes. Yes, it would.
It would, right? So the answer is that even if you're supposed to wash your hands with soap and water, and make sure there's no dirt or grime on your hands before you start washing for bread.
They didn't know about germs 4,000 years ago.
So whether they did or whether they didn't, part of the laws of washing your hands for bread is that you have to make sure your hands are clean before you wash your hands.
Why isn't a person who keeps the laws pious?
Why isn't the person who keeps the laws pious? That's a very good question. Let's get back to that in a moment. So about the blood and about washing of the hands. So washing of the hands before bread is because of ritual impurity. It's a spiritual thing. It's not a physical thing. It's not a germ thing. It's a spiritual thing. Same thing is when a woman has a nida status, the status of ritual impurity. It does not mean that she is dirty, God forbid, or unclean, or anything of the sort. It's a spiritual status, a spiritual thing. And there are certain bloods and certain miscarriages and certain placenta births that would render a woman to be impure, and some would not render a woman to be impure. And King David himself would go to all this trouble back inside. King David went to all this trouble. He would look at the blood and examine it with his own hands. The king of Israel would sit and examine the blood, the babies that unfortunately were miscarried, and would look at the placentas. David went to all this trouble in order to render a woman ritually pure and consequently permitted to her husband. If after examination a sage declares the woman ritually impure, she is permitted to be with her husband, which leads to increased love and affection and ultimately to procreation. And not only do I engage in activity considered to be beneath the station of a king, but I consult my teacher, Mephibosheth, the son of King Saul's son, Jonathan, with regard to everything that I do. I say to him, Mephibosheth, my teacher, did I decide properly? Did I convict properly? Did I acquit properly? Did I rule ritually pure properly? Did I rule ritually impure properly? And I was not embarrassed. Forgoing royal dignity should make me worthy to be called pious. He was involved, and there were things that other people were hesitant to consider pure. Yet King David would go and would look at it himself and would declare them to be pure. That's what he sat and did. He sat and looked at these blood stains. He sat and looked at the placentas himself which is below the dignity of a king. And he had the humility that he didn't just decide on his own. He turned to his teacher after every ruling and said, did I rule correctly? And for this, King David says, I deserve to be called pious.
Is ritually pure the same as spiritually pure?
Yeah. Yeah, ritual purity, it's not a physical thing, is the point over here.
So why is a woman ritually impure when she menstruates, which is a natural function and necessary to procreation?
It's a very good question. A very, very good question. The basic rule is that impurity comes with death. So the reason why we wash our hands when we wake up in the morning is because sleep is considered 1/60th of death. And whenever there's death, the evil forces or the impure forces come and attach themselves and try to gain life and sustenance. So while we're sleeping, where there is a removal of our life, right, our cognitive faculties are not active, the impure forces come and take over our bodies. Again, this is oversimplification, but the purpose, the point of the message is here. So we wake up in the morning and we are alive once again. We wash our hands, nedelwasser, we wash our hands in the morning to get rid of the impurity that remains in our nails. A woman who is menstruating, what is that blood? The uterus.
The blood of a
gearing up-
baby that died.
Sorry?
The blood of a baby that died before it was born.
So not always. In other words, the actual menstruation, the actual blood of menstruation, is that the uterus was gearing up and there was a lot of nutrients that were sent there and the walls of the uterus got thicker, preparing for a possibility of a child. If an egg comes and gets fertilized, then a baby will be born and it will have all the nutrients there waiting for it. But any time that fails, that process doesn't happen. So then all of the nutrients and all of those things have to come out of the body, and that is the blood of menstruation. So menstruation technically is a failed attempt at bringing life. So there was a possibility of life, which is no longer there. And so that's why the impurity comes. Does that answer your question, Steve?
Yes.
Okay. And to the question of why do you have to go beyond the letter of the law to be considered pious, let me ask you guys, what do you think? Why do you think that being pious means going beyond the letter of the law? Anyone?
So all I can think of is a person who follows the letter of the law, does what they're supposed to. They're pious. And if someone goes beyond that, they're heroic.
Yeah.
Okay, that's one way to look at it. I mean, if I pay my taxes, does that make me a pious person?
Makes you a
Well,
law-abiding person.
It makes me a decent human being.
Yeah, letter of the law is expected.
Oh, very good. Yeah, the letter of the law is what's expected of me. I did
Yeah.
what was expected of me.
Right.
Right? If I didn't kill anyone today, does that make me pious? Does that make me a hero? Right? I did the right thing. Right? I'm not a hero. But if I went out of my way and I risked my life to save someone else, so then I'm a pious person. Maybe then I'm even a hero. But if I go beyond the letter of the law, that's when I'm already in a different category. So you have people who are sinners, right? If I'm not, let's put it this way. If I'm not fulfilling the law, the basic letters of the law, so then I'm not a decent person. I'm a sinner, right? If a person is going around stealing, avoiding paying taxes, and these kind of things, whatever the laws are, going against the law, so that he's a criminal. A person who is fulfilling the law is a decent person, and someone who's going beyond that, doing something special, so they're a pious person. That's the way I see it. Does that sound about right?
Well, when I think of pious, I think of someone who's religious and follows the law and, the religious law and obeys the law. That's what I think of pious. I mean, are you saying that someone who just follows the law is impious?
I guess it depends who we're comparing them to. You know what they say? Anyone who is more religious than me is a fanatic, and anyone who is less religious than me is a goy. But yeah, when we think of a pious person, usually that is what we think of. Let's continue this discussion next week about piety, because I like the discussion. It's 11:17, so we'll wrap this up. Thank you, all of you, for your involvement. Thank you, Zalman. That's your name, right? Got it right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Zalman. Thank you for joining. Bela Esther, thank you for joining. Rachalea, thank you for joining. Sarah Esther, feel better. Thank you for joining. Jonah and Susie, feel better. And thank you for joining. Wishing you all a wonderful morning. God willing, see you next week. Same time, same channel.
Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.
The pious channel. Thank you, Rabbi.